Shalom. So just what is a Noahide anyway? Actually, a Noahide officially is any human being who is a descendant of Noah, as opposed to Israel, who are descendants of Abraham, the first Jew. But actually, the concept is very far-reaching, because our sages teach us that God essentially made two covenants in history. The second covenant he made with Israel at the Sinai Revelation, based on their acceptance of the 613 commandments. But prior to this, there exists an ancient covenant. And that covenant is based on what's called the 7 Noahide laws. These are universal laws. They are actually laws pertaining to prohibition against idolatry, a prohibition against blaspheming the name of God, a certain sexual prohibitions, murder, stealing, the concept of what's called Aver min hachai, which means ripping a limb from a living animal, which is actually a whole kind of ecological idea, and also the concept of establishing courts of justice. Now, these commandments are actually quite complex. They're a lot more than they appear to be. They are really alluded to in the Torah, and this is one of the things that makes the concept of the Noahide covenant so interesting. The verses from which our sages deduce these commandments as being binding upon all humanity, we're going to study about this as we continue. This is something which is actually part of the oral tradition, this revelation, and indeed we are taught by our sages that this path, the path of the 7 universal laws, was the ancient path of spiritual fulfillment for all mankind. And so when you think about the great tzaddikim, the righteous people that existed in the world before the Torah was given, when we think about Adam himself, and of course Noah and his children, we think about Chanoch, we think about Metushelach, and we think about all of the righteous people of yore. What was their relationship with God? You know, there is a beautiful idea of a certain degree of Torah which was present in the world even before the Torah was given. And we know, for example, that the forefathers of Israel kept the entire Torah. We know that the great tzaddikim, following the tradition of Adam, had a full and a rich relationship with the Creator. What was this based upon? We know that Jacob, when he was running away from his brother, according to tradition, he went and he studied Torah with Shem and Aver, who were not Jewish, who were the leaders of that generation. And he studied Torah with them for 14 years. What was he studying before the Torah was given? There is a concept of the revelation of God in the world before the giving of the Torah at Sinai. And this is connected to this idea that there is a spiritual path of Torah observance in the world, which is universal in its nature. So these 7 laws are considered to be the very bedrock upon which society, from the very inception of the human race, has been formed. And throughout history, there were actually instances throughout the world of individuals and indeed entire communities that based their relationship with the Creator on these 7 universal laws. Again, a manifestation of the wisdom of the oral tradition. So a Noahide is actually a person who is generically a descendant of Noah and who wants to fulfill, we use it in terms of expressing the idea of a person who wants to fulfill these 7 commandments. There is actually an idea that our sages of blessed memory expound upon, and some of the commentaries, as we'll be learning, and Maimonides and others discuss the idea of a conscious acceptance of a person who literally takes upon himself the obligation, even with a declaration, of wanting to do these commandments because he realizes that they were actually commanded by the God of Israel through the tradition of Moses. And what we're going to be learning about is the idea that these 7 laws are really amazingly broad. They contain all sorts of different circumstances, different applications. They are much more far-reaching than they sound at first. We talk about blasphemy, we talk about idolatry. These things sound to be, very pious and very specific about maybe certain circumstances. And murder, this isn't something that hopefully will come up in many people's lives, and certainly not ripping a limb from a live animal. Well, actually what we're going to discover is that these things have many applications in contemporary life, so that when a Noahide, a Gentile, wishes to live a righteous life as expressed through the Torah, one needs to be informed as to exactly how these rules have application in everyday circumstances. And another thing that we're going to be discussing is really the idea that what all of this is leading us to is the concept that the Torah is a universal plan for the spiritual fulfillment of all humanity, but that within it there are different paths. There is Israel's covenant, and then there is a covenant for all humanity which is based on these 7 laws. But the main idea that the Torah really wishes to stress is that every single human being is able to find clearly a path towards spiritual fulfillment, towards a relationship with the true Creator, towards a realization of the vitality and the vibrance and the positivity and the joy of everyday life through the wisdom of the Torah, and the need for every person not only to just have faith in the heart, but to accept upon himself willingly a covenant that is based on action. Because the real test of a person in this world is how we act. And this is something that we always come back to as we study Torah, the idea that the proof of our real relationship with Hashem and the progress that we're making spiritually is going to be reflected in our action. So a Noahide is essentially a person who is very much aware of the God of Israel, who is very much connected to the Torah, who sees himself as being a precious soul that was created by God with a purpose in this world, and who realizes that the Torah presents him with an opportunity, or her, presents one with an opportunity to ascend spiritually, to leave behind a legacy in the world, to gain as much as possible from living every day, and from growing as close as possible to the presence of God in the world, and by living a life wherein that presence would be reflected. And as we're going to see as we get into further detail, even though these laws again are very basic and they're very specific, there is also a concept of the centrality and the universality of the Torah itself in every way that really resonates to all of humanity. And throughout the generations, there were again many instances throughout civilizations, that is recorded by many ancient chroniclers, of Noahide communities, of Noahide life, and much of it throughout the generations was more minimalistic. It was about keeping these laws. Today, there is a tremendous spiritual desire felt by many in the world, to which we are responding, a desire to be as connected as possible to the Torah, a desire by Gentiles to know, where in the Torah do I stand? How much of the Torah is really applicable to me? And as a Noahide, am I to keep a very narrow walk based on these 7 laws? Or is there a message for me in some of the other Torah observances as well? So this is something that we're going to be talking about in detail. And as we continue, we'll begin to understand that the lifestyle, the challenge, the opportunity for potential growth, which is presented to every human being, Gentiles as well as Jews, throughout the Torah, and specifically this covenant of the Noahide laws, is really a program for total spiritual growth and connectivity and sensitivity to the nuances of the potential for for joy and prosperity and spiritual fulfillment in every day. And so what it really all boils down to is, when we approach the Torah with the faith and the knowledge that it is the blueprint of creation, that it is the plan that Hashem has in the world for the uplifting of humanity and the sanctification of life, and indeed the celebration of life that He gives us, that we understand that, and it should be no surprise, that this is all-inclusive, and that Jews and Gentiles find their place there. As we explore the definition of the Noahide covenant, we'll begin to understand the Torah clearly has a very universal message for all people.